So my name is Buzz Thompson. I'm a professor in the law school as well as in the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. And I've had the pleasure of actually chairing the selection committee for the Bright Award ever since the Bright Award was first awarded 11 years ago at this particular point. It's hard to imagine that we've been doing this for 11 years at this particular point, because every single award recipient is fresh in my memory. Under the award, each year we go to a different region of the world to look for somebody who embodies the type of work on behalf of sustainability that the Bright Award is designed to recognize. And we've now been to all 10 of the regions. We've been everywhere in the world at this particular point. And so this year we are returning to North America. It's great to have you all here. And it's great to be able to make this award in person. As those of you who come to these frequently know, there were several years when we unfortunately could not do that because of the pandemic. I want to not only thank all of you for being here today, I also want to thank the Bright family. As I will talk about in a second, this award was created by Raymond Bright and his wife. Raymond was a law school graduate and somebody who felt very strongly about conservation and sustainability. Since the Bright Award was originally created, we have had an advisory board made up largely of Ray's relatives who have provided us valuable guidance on this particular award. And this year, there are several members of the family here. Mike Bright, who was Ray's, still is Ray's brother, and was one of the original members of the advisory committee. Mike's daughter, Shay Bright, was also able to fly out here for this award today. And then finally, one of Ray's close business associates, Alan Markle, is here this evening. So as I started out by mentioning, Raymond Bright created this award. Ray was at one point, he was the son of a park ranger, and he grew up loving the outdoors. His passion was the environment. His passion was conservation of the environment and sustainability. And so when Ray died, he left a gift to Stanford University, in part to help us to teach and continue to mentor the next generation of conservation leaders in the law school. But in addition to that, to create this prize to recognize those people around the world who are engaged in sustainability efforts. As I mentioned in previous years, we've recognized 10 people for the Bright Award. I actually have a list in my notes here of all 10, but it sort of struck me, we have so many Bright Award winners now that if I just sat here and told you about all 10, it probably wouldn't mean very much. So what I want to do is mention 3 of them in specific, because I think these 3 people really crystallize what the Bright Award is about, which is somebody who not only advocates for sustainability and conservation, but actually gets out there and accomplishes something on behalf of sustainability. So our second award winner, for example, was Art Sterrett, also from Canada, but from the west coast of Canada, who was instrumental in negotiating the preservation of the Great Bear Rainforest. 2 years after that, we had a totally different type of award winner, Polly Cortis. Polly was a professor at Oxford, and it was Polly's idea that you needed to work with businesses around the world to help them learn how to behave in a more sustainable fashion. And so she actually began at Cambridge, the Cambridge University Institute for Sustainable Leadership, and ran it for many years. Polly was so successful at that she actually, several years after she got the Bright Award, became the Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire, a recognition of what she had been able to do during her particular career. And this last summer, actually with several people in this room, I traveled to Jordan to see the work of two of our recipients who had started an organization called EcoPeace Middle East. And the idea behind EcoPeace Middle East, which I think is still the only organization that is run by 3 directors, one Jordanian, one Israeli, and one from Palestine. Their idea was that you could actually use water to bring together the peoples of those 3 areas and to promote peace. As I said, several of us in this room and I traveled to Jordan this summer to actually talk about that particular work because as part of the Abraham Accords, which were negotiated about 5 years ago, one of the things in the Abraham Accord was embodied the idea that EcoPeace Middle East had, which is a project in which Jordan will produce renewable energy because they have lots of land upon which they can produce solar energy. They will produce energy. That energy will go to Israel, and Israel in return will use some of that energy to desalinate water that will then go to Jordan, which is actually one of the driest countries in the world. So that gives you a sense of the type of people that we are looking for when we make this particular award. So I want to introduce our winner in a minute. But before that, I also want to take the opportunity to recognize that Stanford University, the land that we're on right now, is the ancestral lands of the Makani Ohlone tribe. And the land was of great importance to the Ohlone people, still remains of importance today. And consistent with our values of community and diversity, Stanford has a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. And I should just add that the Muwekma Ohlone remain strong partners with Stanford in a variety of endeavors. So the best way I actually think of introducing Val is to start with a video. And the video will actually show you her work and why we have chose her for this award.
We still live in a country of colonialism. We're still living in the day-to-day trauma of the impacts of genocide and of residential school. That's a generational challenge that we're constantly facing. And so by creating this movement of conservation, which means that the lands can stay in the way that they need to be for us to find those solutions and answers, but also in active stewardship of those places, then I'm hoping that we're exposing youth to that power, to that healing, to that love, and to that hope. You know, there was no one more affected by the impacts of climate change in Canada than Indigenous peoples. So many communities are still to this day evacuated and unable to be in their landscapes. There is such a thing as climate trauma. I'm seeing it live right now in communities, and we can do better. I'm a registered professional forester by trade, but even in the efforts of education and school, it was always about how can we do things in a way that respects the rhythms and values and approaches of nature itself, which aligned with who I am as an Innu woman. I think that's part of why I'm so excited about the work that we're doing, because we know our elders say it all the time. If you want to heal, you go to the land. If you want to understand who you are, you go to the land. If you want to find your place in the world, you go to the land.
Valerie's start at the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, which was in many ways her idea, started out as part of a campaign that I was running called the International Boreal Conservation Campaign. And she and many of the other Indigenous employees of that campaign decided they needed to form their own organization, and Valerie led that effort. Indigenous-led conservation systems are the best current way that we have to address the biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis, and the human rights challenges that we face globally. You know, the Indigenous Leadership Initiative is the only organization like it in Canada, and one of the few anywhere in the world where Indigenous people themselves are taking control of and command of the conservation agenda. And that's critical.
It's really a group of leaders and Indigenous peoples from across what is now known as Canada, as well as our close allies who are really dedicated to doing the work with nations and bringing people together to advance the cause of Indigenous-led conservation and stewardship at a national scale. And that includes everything from lobbying the federal government, working with provincial and territorial governments, working with various nations, advancing both Indigenous-led conservation, such as Indigenous protected and conserved areas, but also stewardship programs like Guardians, where it's really about people becoming and earning the responsibility through a job of taking care of the land. There's now over 1,000 working every day to take care of the lands, not only for our nations, but also for everybody who depends on healthy environments and on the values that, in particular, the boreal region brings to the world.
Since its founding, VAL and the ILI have supported the leadership of First Nations that has created 3 Indigenous protected and conservation areas in the Northwest Territories. These protected areas span over 50,000 square kilometers. A lot of these areas are within the boreal forest, the largest intact forest ecosystem left in the world. We hope that this year's award, which marks the 11th anniversary of the Bright Award, further empowers this year's winner in her efforts to support Indigenous-led conservation in Canada.
Valerie is an extraordinary leader. Her skills with people and politics and her ability to understand science, she's put all that together. I admire her humility. I admire her intelligence. I admire her ability to speak with many different voices to many different audiences. She has a gift of bringing people together and speaking to us in ways that we can best understand no matter who we are. Well, she's not the kind of person that seeks an award, and so I'm sure it probably makes her uncomfortable, but it makes the rest of us really happy to know that she's being recognized, because her leadership inspires a lot of people. She's inspired not only her colleagues and the Indigenous community, but all the rest of us in conservation, because she's so clearly drawn the connection between culture, conservation, human rights, and the way that we can move forward together in the future.
What does it mean for me as an individual to accept this award when the reality of my work is that it's collective? I really had to kind of think through my own instincts of humility. I'm honored and touched, and I know that this will help me continue to do the work that I do. The empowerment of Indigenous nations doesn't have to happen at the expense and the disempowerment of others. Valuing and supporting the work of Indigenous nations is good for everybody.
Okay, after that, there's really very little I can say in introducing Valérie, because that really epitomizes her work. I'll just start out with just a personal comment. I actually met Valérie about 8, maybe 9 years ago in the Northwest Territory. And the moment I met Valérie, I was blown away. I was impressed by her vision, by her enthusiasm, by her ability to work with a broad range of individuals, and by her authenticity. Val might work in Canada, but Valérie really is at the forefront of Indigenous conservation around the world. And again, I know that right now Valérie is terribly embarrassed that we're all talking about her. And I know that what she really wants to do is to talk about all of the wonderful people that she works with, and she'll have an opportunity to do that. But this is our opportunity also to recognize the leadership that she has done, what she has accomplished through her various skills. As you know from the video, since 2013, she has served as the director of the Indigenous Leadership Initiative. And through that, I think there are 2 things that are really important that, that she's been able to do. One is that she has brought funding to the protection of large swaths of land, particularly in the boreal forest, that are now indigenous, protected, and conserved areas because of her work, the work of her organization, the work of others. The second thing that she's been able to do is really to help grow the Indigenous Guardians program, so that these lands are not managed by just anyone. They are managed by local experts, the indigenous, traditional peoples of these land, who then are the ones who go out and ensure that the lands are conserved, who help to protect the animals and the plants, who will actually engage in the water quality testing. They are the ones on the ground actually doing the work. And again, what the Bright Award is all about is not just advocating, but getting out there and doing. When I think of the sort of broad set of things that Val does, what strikes me as so important is that what she is able to do is connect, on the one hand, Indigenous self-determination and nationhood with, on the other hand, conservation of vital ecosystems. And one of the things that we know from academic work, actually, is that the stronger the indigenous ownership and control of lands, the better the conservation is. And therefore, the more we are able to do in protecting biodiversity and dealing with climate change. So for those and multiple other reasons, I'm just exceptionally pleased to announce that the winner of the 11th Bright Award is Valérie Courtois. And so, Valérie, I hope that you will now say a few words about how you feel about receiving this award.
I might have a few thoughts about that. Thank you so much, Buzz, for that wonderful introduction and for your support. I was just reminiscing about when we met on Great Bear Lake in Delaney, and Great Bear Lake is one of those amazing places. It's the largest lake completely within the borders of what is now known as Canada, and there's only one community of 600 people there who care for it and have for generations. And so I was just thinking about that earlier. I'm so deeply honored and a little embarrassed, but to be receiving this award, and I would love to extend my heartfelt thanks to the Bright family, to the late Raymond and Marcel Bright for establishing the award, to Mike, who is here and I met earlier, thank you for being here, and his daughter Shay, and to George, who I believe is watching online. Thank you so much for continuing to support the work of people who care and love for their places. I'd also like to thank the members of the nominating committee, Dean Martinez, and the Stanford Law School community for this honor. Again, I'm deeply humbled. I would love to take the opportunity to thank some American colleagues who are here tonight. From the Resources Legacy Fund, who's been a terrific partner, and Buzz is the chair of the board of the Resources Legacy Fund, in supporting the Indigenous Leadership Initiative. And it's wonderful to see several of you here tonight, including my colleague Mike Scott, Steve Kallick, Emily Cousins. Thank you so much for supporting the work that we do. The Pew Charitable Trust has championed Indigenous-led conservation across the boreal forest for over 2 decades and has supported the Leadership Initiative since its inception. Pew is represented here by Gretchen. Thank you for being here, Gretchen. And I also want to acknowledge Pew's ongoing support. I also want to acknowledge our friends at Neotero who are here at the room. Thank you for being here, Michael and David, and for supporting the work that we're doing and being such keystone partners for us. Finally, I'm really happy to say that I have colleagues from the Indigenous Leadership Initiatives team in the audience. So David Flood, thank you for making the trip all the way from Ontario to be here with us. And Melissa, thanks for being here with us as well. Working with you is such a privilege. I had a wonderful time at lunch speaking with the Native American students at Stanford at lunch, and I know many of you are here in the room. Thank you for being here. And you know, you really inspire me. There's nothing I love more than spending time with young people who are out there to absorb and learn and take in as much as possible and to make your mark in the world. And I really can't wait to see what that mark will be. Finally, I'd love to thank my partner, Patrina, who's here with me tonight. Thank you for always supporting me. And thank you all for joining me in this audience today. Receiving the Bright Award is really a huge honor, but it's also a humbling experience because I don't stand here alone. It's not an accident that I'm wearing a granny scarf here. And I don't know if you all know the story of the granny scarf, but this is something that we adopted from the Ukrainian people who came and established in Canada. We love flowers and nature images, but it's something that's worn by our aunties and our grannies, and I wore it especially to honor the people who walk with us in this work, particularly the aunties and grandmas. You know, I have the privilege of being part of a growing movement in Canada and around the globe that is creating solutions to some of the biggest challenges of our time, from climate change to social justice. And the rock stars, they're really on the ground. The rock stars are the elders who share their knowledge, the guardians who help restore caribou herds, and young leaders who are establishing new Indigenous protected and conserved areas. The rock stars are our leaders and nations who fought for generations and continue to be who we are, despite the efforts of genocide and colonialism in Canada, the impacts of which are still felt every day. I'm just lucky enough to have the job of amplifying that work and helping create conditions at the national and international level to ensure that that continues. I'm honored to be part of this movement, and I'm deeply grateful for the opportunities like the Bright Award that will help me share the work with as many people as possible, because we all need hope and inspiration these days. Our home and our mother, our planet, is experiencing great ecological turmoil. We are transforming it to a point where we are risking the survival of millions of species, including ourselves. My homelands, known as Nitisinan, are also experiencing these changes. It is a harsh but strikingly beautiful part of the boreal forest. Nitisinan is at its best when it is cold. Yet we're seeing extreme changes in ice and the health of key species like caribou. And I've seen firsthand the devastating impacts of climate change and the loss of biodiversity in my homelands and across what is now known as Canada. But I've also seen something else, and something that I
really believe can help stem this tide. It's not a technology, it's not a policy made in Ottawa or DC. It's the fundamental understanding that is expressed by our elders this way: if we take care of the land takes care of us. It's not an accident that 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity is on lands managed and loved by Indigenous peoples. We've been in relationship with these plants and animals in our places for millennia, and we care for each other. My people, the Innu people, have lived sustainably and in harmony with our place for nearly 10,000 years. Surely, we have values, insights, strategies, and the right to participate to the global community and be the nations that we are. People who can thrive while taking care of our environments. By fully respecting and supporting Indigenous-led approaches to lands, we can help create a better future for all of us. I've seen the healing power of the land time and time again, and this is why I do this work. I had the privilege of meeting Innu Guardians shortly after my time as a forestry student at the University of Moncton when I moved to Labrador to be the first forestry planner for the Innu Nation. Indigenous Guardians are trained experts who work on behalf of Indigenous nations, and we like to say there are eyes and ears on the land. I kind of like to say there are boots on the ground, or maybe moccasins and mucklucks on the ground. They do everything from monitor water quality to conduct research on climate impacts and help restore caribou, salmon, and moose. But they also help run on-the-land programs that bring youth and elders together and support things like hide tanning camps, language programs, and all of the other cultural revitalization efforts. Upon meeting the Innu Guardians, I immediately saw how transformative being a guardian can be and how it's essential to fulfilling our responsibilities as place-based peoples to ensure that we care for our relationship with our land and waterscapes. I can't overstate the importance of Indigenous-led conservation and stewardship, not only for a healthy environment, but as a fundamental expression of who we are as Indigenous peoples. That in order to succeed as humans, we have to show care and love to all and everything around us. Again, if we take care of the land will take care of us. I think of the late Jared Kwok, the first wildlife guardian for the Tahltan Nation in what is now known as British Columbia. He inspired so many Tahltan people through his work, as well as guardians from across the country through sharing his story. He said, "Being a guardian helped get me through some of the tough times in my life. Being connected to the land and talking with elders helped me overcome my addictions. It brought pride to me, and at the end of the day, I can walk away with the pride of being First Nations." I also think of my friend and colleague, the Honourable Ethel Blondin Andrew, the first woman elected to serve as Member of Parliament in Canada and as the Member of Federal Cabinet. She runs training programs for guardians and young people who dream of becoming a guardian. And she said, "Residential schools cause great grief and intergenerational trauma because they taught us that we are not worthy of love. But we are worthy of love. The kids in our camps get it. They know that being on the land is where they are the best human beings that they can be. And that's why I believe that having more guardians on the landscape will do more for healing from the impacts of colonialism than any other individual program. There could be no better investment in our communities and nations than investing in regaining that connection with the land. Through the work of Indigenous nations in what is now known as Canada, and with the support of the Indigenous Leadership Initiative, or the ILI, we've managed to more than quadruple the number of guardian programs from about 30 in 2014 to now over 200 across the country. That means that every day there are over 1,000 guardians whose job it is to ensure that our lands and waters can sustain us and all the species that live upon and within them. Countless Indigenous nations are rising up to demand and assert our rights and titles, and the opportunity to create and sustain new economic models where conservation and care for our lands and waters are at the center of that model to ensure that our communities can thrive into the future. What Indigenous peoples are doing is nothing short of transforming the country of Canada for the better. But this isn't really just about building up Indigenous peoples. Countless reports around the globe show that lands that are loved and cared for by Indigenous peoples fare far better than any other in terms of biodiversity. And the nations in Canada have been leading that charge. In fact, the vast majority of protected areas have been led or co-led by Indigenous nations in their community, and it's well recognized, including by our Prime Minister and his cabinet, that the only way that Canada can be a global leader in conservation and meet its international commitments is by recognizing, supporting, and uplifting Indigenous-led conservation. Many of the nations are creating Indigenous protected and conserved areas. Taken together, these active proposals span well over 500,000 square kilometers. That's larger than the entire state of California. Many of these areas are within the boreal forest, which stretches from Alaska to the Atlantic coast. It's the largest forest left on the planet, as Buzz explained in the video. It's also a massive storehouse of carbon. In fact, it holds twice as much carbon per hectare as the world's tropical forests. One such example is in the province of Manitoba, the Seal River Watershed Initiative, which is being proposed by an alliance of 4 First Nations. Once completed, it will protect 50,000 square kilometers alone. That's over 5 times the size of Yellowstone National Park. It will protect also the ability to store what is 1.7 billion tons of carbon in its lands and waters and soils, which is equivalent to 8 years' worth of Canada's emissions. Another is the work of the Kaska Nation, who's proposing an IPCA in an area called Dene-Kakusan of over 40,000 square kilometers. That's roughly the size of Switzerland. My own nation has been working to protect our way of life as a people for generations. Tasinan has some of the world's largest hydro developments, some of the world's largest and most important iron and nickel deposits and mines, and has been the site of extensive military training activities. Yet, there remain important opportunities to protect its integrity while recognizing the importance of sustainable development models, including mining and energy development. Members of our nations deserve to have the same standard of living as any other Canadian. You know, I'm very excited about the interest in particular by tribes on this side of the border in the US and around the globe who are asserting and advancing their roles as leaders and guardians too. In fact, we were inspired greatly by the work of rangers in Australia, and their model is something that we often exchange on. It helps that we're both Commonwealth countries to do that work. We hope that our experience in what is now known as Canada can inspire and be a model for you and others, and our planets and societies will be better for it. In closing, I'd like to thank all of you for being here tonight and to share a little bit more about, and to be able to share a little bit more about the Indigenous-led conservation and stewardship and the work of the ILI. If we take care of the land takes care of us, and we can do it together. Thank you.
Thanks, Val. For the past 6 or 7 awards, we've always put together panels, but we decided this year we wanted to do something a little bit different because we wanted to learn more about exactly the type of work that Val is involved in. And we also wanted to explore the degree to which the work that Val and everyone that she travels with, how that work might actually be able to inspire and provide examples for Indigenous conservation here in the United States. So rather than a panel, we're going to do an interview now with Val. And to do the interview, we're really pleased that Shawn Watts has agreed to serve as the interviewer. Shawn is the Director of U.S. Strategy for the Christensen Fund, which does a lot of support for Indigenous leadership. Shawn is a lawyer by background. He became the Director of U.S. Strategy at the Christensen Fund in 2021. And immediately before that, he was Director of the Tribal Law and Government Center, the Tribal Judicial Support Clinic, and the Mediation Clinic at Kansas University, and also has taught at both Columbia Law School and Yale Law School. He is a member of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, and he's also a district court judge for the Prairie Band Potawatomi tribe. So with that, I would love to have Shawn come on up here and interview Val. So again, Shawn, thank you very much.
All right. So I'm told the mics are on now that we're on stage.
Check, check, 1,
All
2.
right.
We're good to go.
They told me I had to stop telling dirty jokes when I got it. I'm going to stop now. So this is really a great opportunity, because any opportunity anyone ever has to get to sit and have a conversation with Val is one you should take. So it was really an easy thing for me to say yes to doing this. So let's just get started. One of the things you've talked about quite a bit is the idea of indigenous-led conservation. In the U.S., that is only really since 2020 started to take off in a meaningful way, largely because we now have an administration sort of staking its legacy on the idea of conservation. And when he decided to stake his legacy on that, I don't think he stopped to count up how much public land the U.S. has, and so quickly figured out that there was no way this was going to be successful without cooperation with indigenous nations within the U.S. So you guys are way ahead of us on that. Give us a sense of what that looks like on the ground in Canada, if you can, please.
Yeah, thanks, Shawn. Indigenous-led conservation for us is not a new concept. In fact, every single land rights assertion, whether that is historical or modern, has really revolved around a conservation issue. If we think about the Cree in what is now known as Quebec, which have the first modern land claim in Canada. Think about that, land claim, where we have to claim our own lands. But aside from that point, was really about making sure that the large hydro developments in Quebec did not affect their ability to be Cree, or the Delgamuukw case in northern British Columbia, which is where our first kind of oral evidence in the court system was accepted, was around conservation for forestry. My own nation's assertion of our rights is to make sure that, as Caribou people, we can continue to be who we are in these large, intact landscapes. We're not saying no to development, but we also can't think about our lands as simply for what they can be used for. We're not superior to any other being in the landscape, and we have a responsibility to behave in that way. And so that's been something that's been ongoing since colonialism. The emergence of indigenous-led conservation in a modern expression really started in the 90s. And again, my nation, the Innu Nation, was a big part of promoting that, fighting low-level flying by military activities, and making sure that the largest nickel mine in the world wouldn't stop the migration of the George River caribou herd, which at the time was the largest herd of ungulates in the world, and all of those sorts of things. So that's something that we've been working for a long time. And today, over 90% of all protected areas in Canada have been either created or co-created and led by Indigenous peoples. So it's just the way that things should be. What we're challenged by is when we have what we call crown governments or state governments through our provinces that resist that movement because of an antiquated view that somehow conservation is opposed to development, rather than seeing it as the opportunity that it can be, which is that it can be a part of the economic model that we develop, especially in a place like Canada or the US. We're amongst the largest countries in the world. We have the largest intact landscapes in the world, and we're countries of law and rights. And so if anybody in the world should get it right, it's us. And so that's what I'm hoping, is that if we can get it right, we can serve as a beacon for others, and hopefully other countries that are still struggling with the human rights issue and the recognition of the role of Indigenous peoples can say, hey, maybe it's not so hard after all.
Yeah. And you talked a good bit about the cooperation that's required with these governments that maybe view the idea of conservation as antithetical to development. What has that cooperation looked like for you? And some of it is because I've heard you talk before about some of the economic benefits of the Guardians program, and as many of those stats as you want to throw out for people, I think would be great for everyone to hear. Some of it seems to me like part of what needs to happen is, as Indigenous people, especially around the concepts of culture and conservation, we have to find a way to speak a language that the state and federal governments understand. So what has that been like for you?
Yeah, I mean, we participate actively to the political life in Canada and in every provincial legislature, territorial legislature, municipalities at every level. We are citizens in the same right, and we've taken advantage of all of those avenues. But there is a resistance sometimes to that model, and so we have done the economic studies. We have spoken to experts. We've brought in people that are trusted by other Canadians. And what we've shown is that in the case of Guardians, the return on investment is anywhere from $2.50 to every dollar invested, and in some cases, 20 to 1. And, you know, these aren't things on just the environment. This isn't about, you know, how much greenhouse gas we can protect. I mean, that's part of the return on investment, but it's also how we can reduce rates of violence against women, or increase the delivery of education, or ensure that our languages are retained, or valuing the whole Indigenous science systems. I mean, we're 51 First Nations in Canada, 634 communities. There's 4 Inuit regions, 51 Inuit communities. That's countless opportunities for an incredible knowledge system that I think we kind of need today. With where we've taken the earth, with our approach to looking at it as if it's meant to serve humanity, rather than looking at it as if we're a part of it.
Right, and so that kind of relationship with the earth that you're talking about, a sort of different viewpoint, Indigenous viewpoint, can you speak a little bit about how that plays into what you do at ILI, and then how that translates into the sort of broader impacts?
Yeah, you know, the ILI is made up of leaders who've served in every leadership expression out there within our tribal governments, but also within our public governments, from former members of cabinet to former chiefs to deputy premiers. And these are people who are looking back at their career and saying, where do I want to spend my energy today? And who have the complete facility to do whatever they want to do in their life, but they're choosing this. They're choosing this because it is a way to achieve things that they may not have always been able to achieve through those other avenues. It's not, you know, you couldn't pay me to be a chief of a community. I think it's the most thankless, amazing, hard job that is out there. You have to deal with everything from negotiating with the largest nickel company in the world to dealing with 3 broken windows in your neighbor's house, all in the same phone call. And I have the luxury of not having to do that in this work. This is easier to me, kind of thinking about these global movements. But speaking that language and seeing and meeting people where they are. The other thing, Shawn, is I find that, you know, we're not so different, Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. Fundamentally, as humans, the thing that we all strive for and want to express is love. And sometimes the Western concept of management and engineering and all of those kind of sciences tend to take the humanity out of that. And I see the impact of that in non-Indigenous communities all the time. And I think it's part of why, you know, Canada is coming to a reckoning with its history, and we're in a process, and colonialism is absolutely ongoing every day. We feel it, the systemic racism is everywhere. But Canadians are really thinking about how we can do better. And I believe through and through that,
you know, we think about the American dream. Well, we have kind of a Canadian dream. We like to think of ourselves as honest brokers in the global community. We're kind of like kind of being the good guy in the room and seeing that. Well, that's only possible if Indigenous peoples can take our place. And I really believe that the future of Canada is actually not as a federal state that has provinces and territories in it, and where there's a Section 92 of our Constitution that gives the provinces the right to uphold and take any resources from time to time for whatever purpose they may need, but as a federation of nations where we can work together to build that ultimate future together and bring everybody up. Because we're rich in every sense of that word, and we should be able to do that.
And that sort of sense of bringing everyone up, then, you talked about some of the commonalities, and I actually think you're dead on about that, which is to say, you know, even the most kind of what we might call greedy capitalist, at the end of the day, would trade all of that to protect his children or to protect his family. And we seem to, you and I, but like we as a society, seem to forget that at the root of it, we're all people, because we look at our actions and we just often attribute motivations. So with some of those, that as a base, that we're all kind of the same, what are ways that you see like the future of cooperation looking, especially around, it seems to me that we are probably 15 to 20 years away from there being no going back on the environment, or climate change especially. So where we are, we've got a little bit of time to reverse course, but not much. So how do you see us working together as kind of similar, all being the same, to get us to a place where we aren't so much out of time?
I mean, we've just suffered the scariest summer in terms of climate in North America that we've felt in a very long time. There's more fires that have burned in Canada this year than all of the fires in the last 10 years combined. And we had flooding, and it's like, I cannot understand people who are climate deniers. I'm like, don't you look outside? Like, are you not hot? Because I am. And I don't think it's, in French we would say it's become an incontournable. It's unavoidable to deal with this problem, and it's starting to cost a lot of money to not deal with the problem. The fires in the Northwest Territories like almost bankrupt the government of Northwest Territories in having to respond to that. This is 70% of their population was evacuated all at once. Their capital was evacuated. That's unbelievable in terms of costs of management. It's way more efficient to plan and to adapt and to think through that. And Shawn, I do think that in many ways we're approaching a tipping point, but I still have hope. Even if we tipped over, I think we have a capacity to learn and adapt and thrive as people, because fundamentally our knowledge systems come from the land, and that land is constantly evolving, constantly changing. And I think, yeah, we'll figure it out. I hope that we figure it out sooner than later, because there's nothing, as a forester, there's nothing that scares me more than a forest fire coming right at you. That's incredibly disruptive, and there's not much you can do about it. And caribou hate fires, and I love to eat caribou. So I really hope that we can figure it out. But if we don't, I still think that as humans, if we work together to find that magic spark where we're ultimately contributing the best of each one of us, that we can create that change. I had a mentor who told me once that with anybody that you meet, you have at least 80% in common with them. They all love their children. They might love the color red. There's things about those people that there's 80% overlap. And yeah, there's probably 20% that we disagree with, and in the case of Canadians, our conservative-leaning folks, there's definitely 20% that I don't agree with them on. But that's not what we should focus on. Like, we've got 80% that we could focus on how to come together.
The 20% we can work over time to figure out how to build those bridges. But let's focus on that part that overlaps, and let's focus on that ultimate potential on how to create this better. And I think by working together, including across borders, we can figure this out. And North America needs to lead that way.
Well, and so speaking of the idea of cross-border cooperation, one of the things that the U.S. federal government has now taken an interest in is this very Guardians program that you've helped set up, and an interest in a real way. And you're getting philanthropy behind you now on setting something like that up in the U.S., and it's sort of being spearheaded up in Alaska, which seems right based on what we know that you folks in the cold part of the world can do. So with that kind of in mind, you've set up this wonderful model, and you talked before about the sharing that you've done with the Ranger program in in Australia. If you were going to give advice to the U.S. as to how to sort of start this anew, because I'm sure you had bumps along the way and you had things where you reversed course and whatever else, so sort of taking the benefit of all of your experiences, what advice might you give to people trying to think seriously about starting this very program in the U.S.?
Those are good questions, and a long, long lecture to answer that question. But in essence, I think
we have 30 minutes.
Great. In essence, I think the most important thing, Shawn, is that the model be really built from the ground up, from the nations, the tribal nations themselves. It's really about empowering the role of those nations. And if there's a top-down approach, that will fail. We don't trust our federal government very much. I mean, the minister comes by and we're all kind of like, what's he going to say next? And is this going to hurt? That's the reality of that colonial impact. And I imagine that your tribal nations experience a lot of the same realities vis-a-vis the federal government. So that top-down imposition isn't going to work. But if we can build it on the ground, and I'm not saying necessarily grassroots, I'm kind of actually talking about grass tops. So the governance and governments of our nations really leading the charge. And if it is about ensuring that the leaders of our nations can make the best decision possible as nations, then we can build the model. And that's something that we really took the time to do in Canada. The ILI or Valérie didn't create the model of Guardians. The nations manage their own Guardian programs. They determine the scope and scale of those Guardians. They determine what they do, what their job is. All we've done is say to the government of Canada, holy cow, this is a great investment opportunity. I mean, the government of Canada spends billions of dollars on social programs in our communities. We have more children in care today than there ever was in residential school. Our health systems are expensive. We have some of the world's highest diabetes rates. We have some of the world's highest suicide rates. All of those things cost the state an inordinate amount of money. Wouldn't it be better to spend it on a program where people feel empowered and where healing is really about just being who you are rather than trying to find your place in a world that might not quite fit with that? Those are the kind of lessons that I really want to see here in Canada, and I really want to see us really reinforcing the links between our nations across the border. As I was saying to some folks, we believe that the border was put between our legs in many ways. It's severed nations for generations. And it hasn't succeeded. I mean, those nations are doing great work. We'll think about our friends in the prairie regions and the work around the buffalo, and Alaska and the Yukon. And if you think about the Athabascans and the Gwich'ins and others, and there has been a lot of collaboration, but we can do way more. And I think by having Indigenous nations across what some call Turtle Island working together on these issues, we can really get it right. And again, as large countries, there's 5 large countries in the world that have the most biodiversities within its borders: Canada, U.S., Russia, Brazil, China. And if you think about who those countries are, U.S. and Canada really have a lot of pressure to do it right because we have political conditions that allow us to do that. And currently, we have political leadership that is listening and that is trying to understand. I wouldn't say they're quite there yet. It's a journey. But 9/10 of change is intention. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I can't wait to see a North America-wide space of collaboration. And Mexico as well has been a leader in this movement. In northern Mexico, the indigenous peoples have been protecting their lands for generations. And we have, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement that exchanges on environment. Our Minister of Environment has hosted the latest meetings on that cooperation, and Indigenous peoples are at the top of the agenda. That's opportunity, and I really hope that you are all, of course, converted since you're here, but that you use your influence and your voices and your power and to help create that space and uplift that work, and so many of you are.
Yeah. And something you and I haven't talked about before, but I'm actually really interested in, is when we talk about designing and really following the lead of the tribal nations here in the U.S. if we're going to try to design a Guardian program. And you also talked about the U.S. and Canada having a responsibility because we have a legal system that will actually support this kind of growth. But one of the problems, at least in the U.S., is when we legislate for tribal nations, we tend to legislate as though there's a monolith. And the Rancheria Indians here in California are radically different from the Pueblo Indians in the Southwest, radically different from the Treaty Tribes in the Northwest, radically different from the Northern Plains Indians, who are very different from the Southern Plains Indians, most of whom are removed from the southeast of the U.S., and so on. So what does the kind of diversity of First Nations look like in Canada? Because that, I could see someone standing up and saying, well, we can't really adopt that program here because our folks are way different.
Yeah, we have just as much difference in our nation as you do. When I say 51 nations, what I mean is 51 major language groups and one can't speak to the other. Like when I could say my language, it's British Columbia, like we don't talk the same language. We don't understand. And the expression of culture is so different. I had the honor and privilege of attending my first potlatch a year ago in the Heiltsuk territory in Bella Bella. And I was fascinated by how that social expression was an expression of governance. It's not just a cultural celebration, but all of those relationships and dues and payments and giving as a form of power. That's not quite how we work in the Innu Nation. We were too busy chasing caribou to have complicated social structures and processes like that. But I do think that what is common is that we are all place-based peoples. Every single one of us, our cultures emerged out of the land. In fact, most of our creation stories talk about an emergence out of water. Our story is a muskrat that dove down and grabbed a piece of the earth at the bottom of the ocean and brought it and put it on the top of the turtle's back, and that was the beginning of North America. And we share that with the Ojibwe, and we share that with other nations, and I think that's the part that we were able to help bring together for this movement, is this idea that as place-based peoples, we all had a sense of what our role in this world was, what our responsibility to those places were as nations, and how to express that through this movement. None of us at the ILI want to impose a model on anybody. We never say, the ILI has a definition of the Guardians. No way. That belongs to the nations. And what an Innu Guardian does, or what a Dene Guardian in the Northwest Territory does, or what a Blackfoot Guardian in Alberta will do is completely different. But fundamentally, they are tooling their communities and nations to do the best work that they can do. And if I think that's what I mean by the commonality. And I think you are also place-based peoples. And so I do think that there's a lot of opportunity to kind of get beyond the variety and the diversity and really think about how empowering that diversity by working together on how we're common is the way forward.
And there are two things that you've talked about already that sort of speak to the commonality, but also some of the difficulties. And so one is this idea of we need to do something sooner than later. And then the other is this idea of not trusting the colonists and specifically the governments. So this idea of sooner than later, it seems to me that part of what the holdup is on getting started now is we have a deep, in the West in general, but the US specifically, a deep belief in being able to find a technological solution kind of lickety-split when there's a crisis. So that's standing in the way of us getting started. This idea of not trusting the government is keeping and losing what little we've been able to keep because of our interactions with the government is keeping, I think, some indigenous nations from wanting to cooperate in a way. But you've been able to talk about and really work with incorporating Western science and indigenous science in a way that has proven really, really successful. Can you talk a little bit about how you're able to do that and what it really means for those two systems to be integrated?
Yeah, you know, like I said, I'm a graduate of forestry sciences program, and you know, that's all about foresters being like, we can manage the forest. We can design it for what we need. Look at that nice piece of wood. And I remember thinking, what? But to its credit, my very first class, I got in, and the professor, it was a forest botany class, and they said, because you know, forestry is really about 50% science and 50% art. And I was like, okay, that I get. We can't even explain photosynthesis, by the way. Western science does not fully understand the act of photosynthesis, fundamental to how plants grow and live and thrive. How the heck are we going to explain and build a technological solution to a forest? The boreal forest, many people think of it as a simple forest because per hectare it doesn't have, you know, the kind of biodiversity that we see in tropical forests and other places, but it's infinitely complicated. That tree in this place will not be the same tree, you know, 10 feet over here will not be the same tree 10 feet over there. There are thousands of ways that each one of those trees, and then millions and hundreds of millions of ways that they interact with each other. The role of mycorrhizal fungi and how that helps kind of ensure the productivity of our forests. They're entire mysteries to us. There's some great movies on it and books for anybody who wants to read about it. Did some work at the UBC. But it is infinitely complex, and that's part of the teachings that we've been giving as Indigenous peoples, that as soon as you think that you know something is the moment you need humility. That is one of the sacred teachings, that the idea that you're somehow all-knowing and superior, that's not a human's job. That's the Creator's job. That's the animal master's job. Our job is to be amongst all of these things and to use, humans have a gift. The Creator gave us the gift of free will. Many other animals don't have that gift. If you're a bird or a fish, or you're stuck in your environment, you're not stuck. I mean, they thrive in their environment. That's probably not the right word, but you're bound by that reality of your life. As humans, we can do whatever we dream of. But that also comes with a responsibility, that if we do that at the detriment of other things, then we are not being humans. We are being something else, something that is outside of the design of creation. And I think that's part of how, as Western and kind of Indigenous sciences coming together, if we just chill and think humbly and look at the beauty of creation and how our place in it matters, and that we have a job to take care of that, and we're responsible for that, then we can come together and make that work. The final thing I'll say is that I'm a forester and planner by trade. I look at maps and put lines on them and figure out what we can do in there. That's my origin story. But I remember the elders talking to me and saying, it's not really just about you using your forestry sciences over here and your indigenous science over here and being Innu over here. This is your job as planner, as a human being, is to take the best available information, no matter where it comes from, and making the best decision possible that matches with the fact that you love this place. And so I really do think that as, whether we have those kind of sciences and kind of differences in perspective, we can come together and make the most of those two things. And really find the solution. I guess one more thing, because Indigenous, and I got the mic. It's strapped onto me. Actually, they can't do anything about it. The plants and animals, our science kind of emerged out of that, but we can really find a way of benefiting all of that. And Western science does things really well that Indigenous science doesn't do so well. Our word, we have a word for land. It's assi. The caribou moss for the most important species that we have is also called assi. And the little plant over there is also called assi. It's not because we don't care about them, it's because we were chasing caribou too often to really notice the specific differences between all the different kinds of lichens that are out there. Western science has enumerated hundreds of species of lichens within the boreal forests, and that's fascinating to me. Why can't we just take that, plus the understanding that Innu and others have of the relationship between these things and the places and the weather and the climate and all of the different species and how that results in this amazing creation, and just do the best. And so that kind of really specific reductionist approach to Western science is not an Achilles heel if you can join it with that holistic approach of Indigenous sciences. And who knows? I think that will apply to technology as much as anything else. And maybe there will be some minor technological advances, but first I think we need a little dose of humility.
And so I'm going to ask you to not be humble for a moment and do this and answer this question instead. These programs are getting kinds of results, and you've definitely laid out some of the economic stats for us, and we appreciate that. But I guess I want to sort of dig a little deeper. You mentioned the gentleman who talked about that being a kind of a real therapeutic approach for addiction and so forth. And those are all really fascinating things too. But in terms of on the ground results for what goals we're trying to achieve, which is conservation, climate objectives, and so forth, why is this a better approach than something else?
Well, because we know it works, and the evidence is there. As we said, it's not an accident that 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity are on lands loved and managed by Indigenous peoples. I've seen what the transformed landscape looks like. As a forester, believe me, I've seen what a clear cut looks like and what that can do to the environment. We just know it does right. It's also like anybody who's struggled in their life, the way that you get out of struggle in a sustainable way is by finding the help and the strength in the people and places around you, and actually, getting up on your own 2 feet in many ways. There's this idea of self-determination being the ultimate ingredient of sustainability. And governments have tried to impose programs on us time and time again. Residential school
an imposition of not so great intentions, but I don't believe that everybody who was in a residential school had terrible intentions. I have family members who worked in the residential school in my community, which, by the way, was the last residential school to close in Quebec. My father is a survivor of that school, and other family members. And I you know, my grandmother's brother worked in the residential school, and he's a wonderful person. I truly believe that he was there for his time to do his best, and I do think that kind of imposition is part of what created the problem. And in fact, he saw the impacts of that imposition and left the school eventually. But that is what will help us heal out of this. This is not, we've been designed for enough. Like, that's part of what I told the Canadian government when we were advocating for funding for Guardians. They were like, great, we're going to create a program. I was like, absolutely not. Have you ever tried to apply to one of those programs? It's the most soul-sucking, inhuman process ever. It's like this online form that'll never load up, and oh my God, I have to give them a theory of change again. And, you know, I said, enough. Like, why don't you trust us to do this ourselves? We have just as much interest in this working out, if not more, than the Canadian government. Believe me, our people are dying from the disconnection with our places, from the impacts of colonialism. We can figure it out. And we've been asking for it from the beginning. And we've always offered solutions. But oh no, that's a non-educated person. Oh no, they're just, you know, they grew up in the bush. They don't know what this modern governance things looks like. Oh no, they can't manage their monies. God, if you looked at Canada in the early years of its existence, their money management wasn't that great either. Yeah, I think this idea of like bootstraps, us figuring it out, but not doing it to the detriment of others, and really putting our values in the forefront is that sustainable model. And I hope that that's part of the lessons that tribes here will, and the government in particular, and those in power, those with money, those with influence, will say, you know what, if we trust these guys and these people, then perhaps there could be something magic that happens. And that's what happened in Canada.
I think we're getting there, actually, and we will see if we have any more time to do that as our 2024 election comes around, because that'll determine how quickly we end up changing course back to whatever we've been doing for the last couple hundred years. So that will be helpful. If we have about 5 minutes left, and I want to drag us to a topic that we have not discussed and was not on the table, but I feel like it's one that we have to take advantage of because of where we're sitting. So we are in front of an audience of people who go to a top of the top law school, which means whatever these students want to do with their lives, they're absolutely going to have the opportunity to do. And there are certainly paths that law schools like this, like the law school I went to, encourage people to follow that wouldn't necessarily lead them to where you and I are now. So what's a good argument or a good piece of advocacy to get these students out here to, instead of ending up at whatever the 5 or 10 most prestigious law firms are in the world, but instead do something that can make a real difference? What's a good piece of advocacy for that?
You know, I think I've always believed that we need people in every portion of society. The thing that matters is not whether you're, you know, environmental lawyer who hangs off bridges on the off time working for Greenpeace, or you're in big law firms professionally lobbying governments, or it's that we all kind of pull on the anchor of non-change that governments like, you know, their governance by design kind of like to stay who they are as much as possible. What really matters is that we're all pulling on that kind of arc of change. And so whatever you decide to do, whether it is to be in that large law firm or work for government or work for tribes, I hope some of you will work for tribes, that would be great. As long as you're doing it with the intention of leaving the earth a better place than when you got there, as long as you're doing it with the emotion of love in front of you, as long as you're doing it thinking about the generations past and the generations to come, I think we'll get there. And I really believe that. I love that there are people who are diverse. I'm fascinated by the whole spectrum of law. And by the way, my mother is a lawyer by trade. She went to law school. She started law school when I went into high school, and she graduated the year that I graduated high school. She later was the lawyer for the government of Canada in the creation of Nunavut. She did the federal land transfers and she's watching. Hi, Mom. She's married to an Innu man who's a survivor of residential school, and she's working for the government of Canada in the Department of Indian Affairs. And but I'm so proud of the work that she was doing because I know her. She's a woman who loves, and she did such a great job, despite the name tag that she wore and the representation that she wore. And in fact, she was doing that work at 9/11. She was stuck in Iqaluit when all the planes were grounded for a number of days because she was helping finalize all of those federal land transfers that were happening. And my father is an RCMP officer. He's a policeman for the very federal service that put our people in jail for not going to school. A survivor of residential school, a policeman in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. But he also was he was the author of the very first suicide prevention strategy for the RCMP. So I think those are great examples that you can be who you are in the environments that you choose, as long as you're doing it, again, with love in your heart and to be who you are. Also, spend some time in the bush. That would be great. If you're in a firm and you're in New York City, Stanford's not bad. There's lots of trees here. It's beautiful. But if you're in one of those large cities, it's really hard to forget. It's really easy to forget what you're doing this work for. In fact, that's why we built the village at COP15 in Montreal when we were having those meetings. I wanted leaders and people to have their feet on the grass, on the ground, while they were talking about the earth. And so certainly take the time to do that. But don't feel like your life choices in where you end up can limit your ability to create change and to create good. Every single one of you will do that.
Yeah. And I will just say to you, being in this area is actually really kind of a privilege in terms of, we all know now that the ABA is requiring you guys to do more and more pro bono hours, right? And so there are opportunities to serve Indigenous people right here where you are. The Amah Mutsun are doing incredible things with the environment. They're just a little bit, I actually don't know directions well enough, south or north, but close. Whichever direction it is, it's close. So there are lots of opportunities to get involved. But Val, we have 2 minutes. Anything you want to leave us with for the last 2 minutes? We'll just give you the floor.
Like I said, this is not really about Valérie the person. I certainly recognize the value of leadership and the importance of it, and I take that responsibility very seriously. But I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. I have some of the most amazing colleagues. I have some of the most amazing family. We have, this is really a culmination of so many people's love and dedication for our places, for our planets, and for our planet and for each other. And so I just wanted to acknowledge all of those great shoulders that I'm standing on.
Excellent. Well, as I said, always a privilege to get to spend any time with Val. It was worth flying all the way out here from Kansas City just for these 45 minutes. So I really appreciate it. Thank you, Val, so much. We love you.
So, Shawn, thank you very much for absolutely fantastic discussion with Valérie. Valérie, thank you very much again for all of the work that you are doing and for joining us this evening to receive the Bright Award. And again, thanks to all of you. I encourage you to take a look, if you've never done it, at the Bright Award website, which also has a video on the 10 years of awards that we had provided, as well as podcasts with every single award recipient so far, except for Valérie. So she'll be doing one soon. Anyway, thank you all. Have a great evening.